I never thought I'd feel this way about my friend's aunt. But then she looked at me, and everything changed. The first time I met her, I didn't know my life was about to tilt in a direction I hadn't expected. It was just a casual weekend at my friend's place. A small family gathering, laughter spilling into the warm sunlight that filtered through the living room windows. I had come to hang out, talk about trivial things, the usual young adult chatter. But then she appeared. She moved with an effortless grace that made even the simplest gesture. Pouring herself a cup of tea, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, feel deliberate, magnetic. I caught myself noticing her without realizing it. The soft way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, the warmth in her voice that made even a mundane sentence sound comforting. She wasn't loud or attention-seeking, but she carried a quiet confidence that drew the room's energy toward her. And yet, behind that confidence, I sensed something softer, almost fragile, like a layer of vulnerability she didn't often reveal. Our first conversation was casual, nothing extraordinary on the surface, but every word felt layered with a subtle tension. I remember reaching for the same snack she did, our fingers brushing just for a second. A small electric spark traveled up my arm, and we both smiled, slightly embarrassed, slightly aware of the moment's weight. It was brief, unspoken, but it left a mark. Even her gestures lingered in my mind. How she adjusted the cuff of her sleeve, the faint scent of her perfume as she leaned forward to laugh at something my friend said, the small tilt of her head when she listened intently. Each detail, the warmth of her presence, the calm steadiness in her voice, pulled me in more than I cared to admit. There was an unexpected magnetism I couldn't rationalize. I caught myself stealing glances when I thought she wasn't looking, marveling at the natural elegance she carried. I noticed the way she interacted with others, not as a distant figure, but with a subtle attentiveness that made people feel seen. That day, I realized this wasn't just a casual acquaintance. There was something compelling about her, something that stirred curiosity and a strange, cautious admiration in me. By the time the evening ended, I felt an unfamiliar tug in my chest, a mixture of intrigue, hesitation, and quiet longing. I didn't fully understand it yet, but I knew one thing. Meeting her had shifted something inside me. And as I walked home that night, replaying small gestures, small smiles, I couldn't shake the sense that this was just the beginning of something I hadn't expected, something that might change the way I saw connection, intimacy, and desire altogether. This first encounter planted a seed, subtle yet insistent, setting the stage for a slow, deliberate unfolding of emotions. And though neither of us realized it, the story between us had quietly begun. It wasn't planned, of course. Our paths seemed to cross more often than coincidence could explain, and each meeting left a quiet imprint on me I couldn't ignore. The second time I spent real time with her, it was subtle, almost mundane, but beneath the surface, the small moments carried weight I didn't yet know how to name. It started with something ordinary, a shared errand while visiting my friend's home, or helping her carry groceries down a narrow staircase. The task itself was trivial, but being near her, moving in the same space, talking without pretense, felt surprisingly intimate. She laughed easily, and I found myself drawn not just to the sound but to the way her entire expression softened, her eyes lighting up in a way that made it impossible not to notice. I caught myself lingering in the conversation, asking questions not because I had to, but because I genuinely wanted to understand her world. The small details she revealed about her life, her routines, the things that brought her comfort. The connection grew quietly, in these unexpected gaps between people and obligations. She shared stories with a mix of warmth and wry humor, and I realized she noticed the little things too. The way I absent-mindedly fiddled with a pen, the slight hesitation in my voice when I was unsure. There was a moment when we both reached for the same chair, and our hands brushed briefly. It was a fleeting contact, almost nothing, yet it made my chest tighten. She glanced at me, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips, and I felt a strange thrill in that silent acknowledgement. It wasn't just physical awareness. It was emotional. I began to sense layers beneath her confident exterior, a quiet sadness or unspoken longing, and I wanted, almost instinctively, to offer reassurance. At the same time, She seemed to notice things about me that I didn't always show. The way I observed without speaking. The subtle gestures that revealed when I was uncomfortable or excited. It was uncanny how effortlessly she read me, without judgment, without forcing conversation. There was a tension, too, soft and unspoken, like the air just before a storm breaks. Our glances lingered longer than polite conversation allowed. When she leaned forward to emphasize a point, I noticed the faint warmth of her presence. When I laughed, she watched with that gentle, curious look that made me feel both exposed and understood. It was a quiet kind of attraction, one that didn't need words yet filled every pause between us with meaning. By the end of that unexpected afternoon, I was aware of a strange, magnetic pull toward her. A curiosity that went beyond admiration or fleeting attraction. It was the sense that there was something significant waiting to unfold, a connection quietly forming in the shared spaces, in the casual touches, in the moments we didn't fully realize we were creating together. That day, I walked away feeling lighter, yet my mind was tangled in thoughts of her. Each smile, each glance, each gentle touch lingered, a reminder that this wasn't a casual friendship. Something had shifted, almost imperceptibly, and I knew the story between us was beginning to deepen. It happened quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a door opening in the middle of an ordinary day. We were sitting on the edge of her porch, the evening sun casting a soft, golden glow over the neighborhood. The world around us felt distant, blurred by the gentle hum of distant traffic and the occasional bird call, as if the universe had given us a small, private space. I remember thinking how ordinary the moment seemed, just two people talking, but something in her eyes told me it was anything but ordinary. She hesitated before speaking, her hands resting lightly on her lap, fingers tracing invisible patterns on the fabric of her jeans. I noticed the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her gaze flickered to the horizon, as if she were measuring the risk of revealing herself. And then she did. She spoke of something deeply personal, a quiet struggle, a fear she had tucked away beneath layers of composure. Her voice wavered slightly, not from weakness but from the weight of trust she was extending to me. Listening to her, I felt a warmth spread through me, a mixture of admiration and protectiveness. I wasn't just hearing words. I was witnessing a side of her that few people saw, and yet, even in that vulnerability, she exuded grace. There was no self-pity, no dramatics, just honesty, a quiet, raw, human truth that made my chest tighten. I wanted to reach out, to reassure her with words and gestures, but I also knew the power of just being present. So I let silence speak, letting her know with my attentive gaze and gentle nods that she was seen, understood, and valued. At one point, she leaned forward slightly, and our knees brushed. The touch was accidental, fleeting, but it sent a ripple of awareness through both of us. Her fingers brushed mine as she shifted, a tiny, intimate gesture that carried a weight far beyond its simplicity. I felt her pulse in that moment, rapid and real, and I realized how connected we were becoming. Not just through conversation, but through these small, charged touches that neither of us could ignore. There was a pause, a quiet space filled with unspoken understanding. I noticed the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the gentle rise and fall of her chest, the soft warmth radiating from her presence. I felt a mix of nervous anticipation and calm reassurance, a strange cocktail of emotions that made every second linger longer than it should. In that shared silence, I recognized the subtle pull of something more, something tender, unspoken, yet undeniably present. By the time the evening ended, we were both aware of a subtle shift in our connection. The casual curiosity that had first drawn me to her had evolved into something deeper, more intimate. I felt a stirring of emotions I wasn't ready to label, but I knew one thing for certain. Our bond had crossed an invisible threshold. The vulnerability she had shown me was a quiet invitation, and the spark it ignited between us was impossible to ignore. That day marked the first moment I truly saw her, not just as my friend's aunt, but as someone whose heart and presence could touch mine in ways I hadn't anticipated. And as I walked away, replaying every word, every glance, every accidental touch. I understood that this connection was only beginning to unfold. After the first moments of shared vulnerability, everything seemed more complicated. I noticed it in the way I felt a little heavier around her, as though each glance or accidental touch carried more weight than it should. It wasn't that anything had changed overtly. Our conversations remained casual, our laughter light, but beneath the surface, a quiet tension had begun to grow. Every time I saw her, I became hyper-aware of the space between us. I noticed how her hand lingered near mine while reaching for something, how her smile felt just a little too warm, how her eyes held a hesitation I didn't fully understand. And in response, I found myself withdrawing at times, afraid that my curiosity or attraction might be misinterpreted, or worse, that I might cross an invisible line I couldn't uncross. It wasn't just my own hesitation. I could sense that she was holding back too, though with the subtle grace she always carried. There were moments when her laughter faltered, or her gaze flickered away when our eyes met for too long. Sometimes, she'd lean slightly closer when sharing a story, only to shift back as if suddenly reminded of the distance she needed to maintain. Those tiny adjustments, almost imperceptible to anyone else, made my heart clench with the quiet realization that she was struggling with the same conflict I was. The social dynamic added its own layer of restraint. She was my friend's aunt, a woman whose life experience dwarfed mine, and there was a natural fear of judgment hovering over both of us. I caught myself imagining what others might think, what lines might be crossed in their eyes, and it made me hesitant to act on the fluttering warmth in my chest. I didn't want to ruin anything. Not the bond we were forming, not the trust she had shown me. And yet, the pull toward her was undeniable. Physical proximity became a delicate dance. A brush of hands while passing a book, a fleeting touch on the shoulder when moving through a narrow hallway. Each contact left a lingering awareness, a tension neither of us could articulate. Sometimes, I'd catch her watching me when she thought I wasn't looking, only for her gaze to dart away when I met it. Every small gesture, every fleeting look, became a conversation in itself, rich with unspoken emotion and cautious restraint. Internally, I was torn between desire and reason, curiosity and caution. I wanted to be near her, to hear her laugh, to feel the warmth of her presence, but I also wanted to honor the invisible boundaries that existed. Each encounter became a test of patience and self-control, a slow exploration of emotions that refused to be ignored but demanded careful navigation. By the end of this period, I realized that our connection was no longer casual. It had grown into something more profound, a silent tension that neither of us could fully escape. Yet the struggle itself became part of the story, the slow, deliberate build of attraction and understanding that made each small gesture and lingering glance more meaningful. And as I walked away after each interaction, I carried a mix of anticipation and anxiety, knowing that the next meeting could tip the delicate balance we had created, for better or worse. After weeks of quiet tension, our connection began to evolve in subtle but undeniable ways. The hesitation and restraint of the previous days were still there, like a fine thread holding back the current of emotions swirling between us. But now, moments of intimacy, small, deliberate gestures, started to emerge, carrying a weight that neither of us could ignore. It often began in the most ordinary of circumstances, helping her carry groceries, tidying up after a casual gathering, or sitting side by side while sharing a cup of coffee. In each instance, the space between us seemed charged, almost magnetic. I noticed how she leaned slightly closer when speaking, the warmth of her presence brushing against me like a soft, comforting weight. And when our hands accidentally touched, brief, fleeting, as if by coincidence, I felt a pulse of awareness that lingered far longer than the contact itself. One afternoon, we found ourselves alone while organizing a small shelf of books she had asked me to help with. As we crouched side by side, our knees brushing, I felt the gentle rise and fall of her shoulder as she reached for a book. Her hand grazed mine, lingering just enough for a flutter of electricity to pass between us. Neither of us spoke, but the silence was filled with a shared understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of the tension that had been building for weeks. Our conversations, too, began to shift. We laughed more easily now, the humor softer, warmer, more personal. I started noticing the little nuances, the way her eyes sparkled when she was amused, the subtle tilt of her head when she was listening intently, the way she occasionally brushed her hair back, almost unconsciously, as if inviting proximity. In these moments, I realized that our bond was no longer just emotional. It was tactile, alive in the way we moved and responded to each other. There was also an increasing awareness of proximity. Sitting on a bench in a quiet park, we found ourselves slightly closer than necessary, our shoulders brushing with every shared movement. I caught myself studying the curve of her smile, the warmth of her gaze, the gentle cadence of her voice as she spoke. And she, I think, was noticing me in the same way, the way I laughed a little too loudly, the way my hands fidgeted when I was nervous, the subtle expressions that revealed what I often tried to hide. By the end of these afternoons, the intimacy we shared felt natural, effortless, and yet profoundly charged. There was no need for words to define what was happening. Every glance, every accidental touch, every pause in conversation spoke volumes. We were learning each other's rhythms, discovering the quiet language of proximity and affection, and feeling the slow, deliberate pull towards something deeper. The most beautiful part was that it didn't feel rushed. Every gesture, no matter how small, was savored, an exploration of connection that went beyond surface-level attraction. And as I walked home afterward, replaying the moments, the touches, the smiles, I realized that we had crossed another invisible threshold. The bond we had formed was evolving into something tender, intimate, and undeniably alive. A shared intimacy that neither of us could ignore, yet both of us were still navigating with care. The evening had a quiet magic to it, the kind that makes the world feel suspended just beyond the edge of reality. We had ended up alone, almost by chance, on the small balcony of her apartment. The city lights stretched in the distance, soft and golden, and a faint breeze carried the scent of jasmine from a nearby planter. I realized, in that suspended moment, how different everything felt when it was just the two of us. She spoke first, hesitantly, her voice softer than usual, almost a whisper against the quiet night. "I didn't expect to feel this way about you," she said. The words fell into the space between us, startling in their honesty, yet entirely natural, like they had been waiting to be said all along. I felt my chest tighten, a mix of anticipation and relief washing over me. The subtle warmth of her hand brushed against mine as she adjusted her position, and the simple contact sent a shiver of awareness through me. I didn't speak immediately. Instead, I let the moment linger, letting my gaze meet hers, noticing the slight tremor in her fingers, the vulnerability in her eyes that only a few people had ever seen. It was intimate, powerful, and terrifying all at once. Finally, I found my voice, quiet but sincere. "I feel the same way," I admitted. The words were heavier than I expected, yet they carried the truth I had held in silence for weeks. For a long moment, we just looked at each other, neither speaking, letting the confession settle into the space around us. There was a charge in the air, gentle but undeniable, the kind that makes you aware of every breath, every heartbeat. She leaned slightly closer, and our shoulders brushed, an electric yet tender contact. It wasn't dramatic, not in a cinematic way that demanded attention, but subtle, real, and deeply meaningful. I reached out, placing my hand over hers, careful, respectful, but unable to resist the urge to connect physically. She didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers lightly curled around mine, and I felt an unspoken promise in that small gesture. The warmth of her presence, the softness of her gaze, the subtle tremble in her smile, all of it coalesced into a quiet, mutual understanding. This was no longer a game of accidental touches or stolen glances. This was acknowledgement, two hearts recognizing the connection they had both tried to navigate silently. We spoke then, slowly, carefully, about what this meant, about the risks, about the strange, complicated beauty of what we were feeling. Every word was honest, measured, and filled with the kind of intimacy that comes only from real vulnerability. There was laughter too, gentle and soft, bridging the nervousness that lingered between us. And when our conversation dwindled into quiet companionship, the night felt fuller, warmer, as if the confession itself had changed the air around us. By the end, we sat close, hands intertwined, leaning slightly toward one another, comfortable yet acutely aware of every small gesture. The tension that had built over weeks of longing and restraint had finally found its release, not in flamboyance, but in subtle, tender acknowledgement. And in that quiet, suspended moment, I realized that whatever came next, whatever challenges awaited us, the truth had been spoken, and that honesty had changed everything. The days after our confession were different, but not in a dramatic or overt way. Life continued with its ordinary rhythms, work, errands, quiet routines. But now there was a subtle shift, a gentle undercurrent that had taken root between us. The tension and longing that had previously hovered in our interactions had transformed into something warmer, steadier, a quiet affirmation of the bond we had acknowledged. We found ourselves seeking out moments together not out of obligation, but because it felt natural. A shared cup of coffee in the morning sunlight, sitting side by side while flipping through a book, walking slowly along quiet streets as the world moved around us. In each of these ordinary moments, there was a new intimacy, a comfort in silence, a closeness in casual gestures that once would have set my heart racing. Her hand brushed mine occasionally, lingering just long enough to remind me of our connection, and I found myself savoring every subtle touch. There was a new ease in our conversations. We spoke about the future cautiously, aware of the complexities but unafraid to acknowledge the feelings that had grown between us. There were moments of playful teasing, laughter shared over small jokes, and serious conversations where we bared pieces of ourselves that we had never offered to anyone else. Every glance, every gentle smile, every light touch of shoulder or hand conveyed the understanding that words sometimes could not. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in soft pink and gold, we found ourselves sitting on her balcony again. The city lights began to twinkle in the distance, but it felt like the world had narrowed to just the space between us. She leaned slightly toward me, her hand brushing against mine, and I instinctively took it, holding it gently. We didn't need words to convey what we were feeling. The small, deliberate gestures said everything. The warmth of her presence, the softness in her eyes, the quiet confidence in her smile. All of it told me that this connection was no longer fragile or tentative. It was real. We didn't rush into declarations or dramatic statements. Instead, we allowed the intimacy to unfold naturally, respecting the slow rhythm that had carried us this far. Our shared moments became a tapestry of understanding and affection, a mix of laughter, quiet reflection, and meaningful touches. Even the simplest things, sharing a blanket on a chilly evening, brushing hair away from her face, leaning closer to hear her speak, felt like affirmations of the bond we had nurtured carefully over weeks and months. By the end, there was a sense of completeness, not because every question was answered or every uncertainty resolved, but because we had acknowledged each other fully. We were together, aware of the challenges ahead but confident in the depth of our connection. And as we walked side by side, hands brushing, hearts quietly aligned, I realized that the slow, deliberate unfolding of our relationship had created something enduring, something tender, intimate, and profoundly human. The story hadn't ended with a grand declaration, but with a quiet, mutual understanding. We had found each other, and that alone was enough to carry us forward. If this story tugged at your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe for more slow-burn romances, heartfelt confessions, and emotional connections that stay with you long after the video ends. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever felt an unexpected connection that changed everything? Let's talk about it.